This evening is actually, in that sense, very much owed to Victor Schermer, who is senior staff writer at All About Jazz, and who has been a great partner also just in getting word out about this. All About Jazz is a co-sponsor, as is Jazz at Princeton, so my thanks to them. I'm going to actually hand things over in 1 second to Victor to introduce our guests. And he will then be joining the conversation. Just a couple practical things before I do that. If you want to get a book and have it signed, you can do that after the conversation wraps up, which will be after a Q&A, so there will be time for your questions. And then you can just pay on your way out. You don't have to pay first. If you aren't already on our mailing list for events like this, we have about 3 or 4 a week during the semester. So busy schedule. I'll flag for you an upcoming event, which is a conversation about Bob Dylan's Poetics. It's a really nice MIT Zone book about the poetics of his songs, poetics and politics of his songs. So that's just one that's coming up in the next couple of weeks, but there are many, and you can leave us your email address on the sign-up sheet if you want to get one email a week with a sort of digest of what's coming up. That's it from me, so I'm going to hand things over, but please give all these guys a first round of applause.
Thanks a lot. My name is Vic Schermer. I'm a senior staff writer at All About Jazz. I like to write and I love jazz, so that's how I got to do that. And I got the idea for this because this is my favorite bookstore in the whole world. And I live in Philadelphia. But I don't know what it is about this place, but I became a reading addict after I started coming here. So, you know, like, we already met some of the people and some of you folks coming in, but we really want this to be a group kind of thing. And Maxine is that way. She always brings everybody else in. So, we're going to have I'll be sort of, you know, just kind of a moderator. And I may have a few comments, but after I introduce Maxine and Rick, you know, Maxine is going to kind of take over and say some things, and then she'll bring us in for a while, right?
Right.
And then when we feel it's right, we'll bring everybody into the discussion. We really want to hear what your thoughts are, and it turns out people have memories of the recordings or the events. Yeah, I think to share them would be wonderful. So, now, you know, in thinking about what to say, it occurred to me that one of the things Maxine says in the book about Dexter Gordon, which is what the book talk is all about, is her book, Sophisticated Giant, and it's about the great jazz musician Dexter Gordon. And one of the things she says about him is that he loved to read. So, you know, he probably would have loved this place. So, and everybody here probably is a music lover and a book lover, so we all have that in common. The other thing that hit me when I was listening to some of his music the other day, and that the way he improvises is like a labyrinth. You really listen to it carefully, you see that he goes with all kinds of twists and turns, but he goes right to the heart of the song. And he always emphasized the lyrics, like his hero Lester Young did. And then he takes you out gradually. And it's like, it really is like a living experience. That's one of the great things about his music. It's a bit of your life that's in it. I should say a little bit about Dexter just to set the stage, but you probably all know about most of this. But, you know, he was the jazz tenor saxophone player. There was one in each instrument. I played trombone. My hero, J.J. Johnson, was the one in trombone. And he made the transition in tenor saxophone from the swing era to the bebop and hard bop era. And I was talking with Rick earlier, and that, you know, Dexter Gordon was already playing some bebop stuff in the early 1940s, which was before they actually coined that term. So he was right in there, and he transformed the music. And he then went to Europe after he became famous here and made records for Blue Note. He went to Europe and he did all kinds of incredible recordings and shows in Europe for many years. And then, you know, we'll find out that it was Maxine that helped him come back to the United States for his homecoming, which was a famous event in the history of jazz, where he came and played at the Village Vanguard and some other clubs, and people suddenly realized who he was, you know. And then Bruce Lonvall came and gave him a big contract with Columbia Records. So, you know, he was almost forgotten in the United States, is that right? Well, you have to say something about that. But when he came back to the United States, he sort of rose again here. And then in the 1980s, he suddenly became a movie star. So I don't know how many people here know that he was given a Grammy a Oscar nomination for the film Around Midnight. And you know, the way he played that part of that jazz musician, who was a sort of a combined figure of Lester Young and Bud Powell. You know, that he was masterful the way he did that. And I believe that Marlon Brando thought that Dexter was as good an actor as he was. So he did all right. And one of his albums is called Doing All Right. And so the other thing about him was his presence. And he was a tall man. I had an argument with Maxine as to whether he was 6'3" or 6'4". 5. Somehow that never resolves it. But anyway, he was very big, and he had a presence on the stage that was really unforgettable. And people remember that. And he was a very warm person. He somehow, you know, conveyed something about humanity in the way, you know, you watch some of the film clips and stuff. He was right with the people that were there. And then, I can't do an imitation of it, maybe somebody can, but the way he would introduce a song, you know, in this deep, deep voice. He'd say the lyrics of it. And he would just bring out a feeling of being very close to the song. It meant so much to him. So his presence is something unforgettable. There's so much more that can be said about him, but that's, I like to talk because I'm from Brooklyn, but I should shut up now. Let me introduce Maxine Gordon, and it's such a pleasure for me to introduce Maxine because I got to know her a few years ago. I did an interview with her. And, you know, I'm really touched by the fact that how much dedicated she is to the musicians, because I see how much the musicians struggle. And if there's anyone that's given herself to helping these guys and knows what she's doing, actually, it's Maxine. And, you know, she's given so much to the music and the musicians because she's just that kind of person. And she was, were you married to Woody Shaw?
No.
Okay, you were partners, though, right?
Yes.
Okay. So she was partners with Woody Shaw, and she was, after Woody passed away, she married Dexter. And you know, That's, okay, I don't want to get into that area, it's too much.
It's in the packet, in the book.
It's in the book.
But anyway, the point is that she made a huge difference in their lives, and she made a huge difference in the lives of many more musicians, and I'm particularly thinking of the organist Shirley Scott, who many of you may know her incredible music. She was very close friends with Maxine. And Maxine, the other thing that impresses me is that she wrote this book from two perspectives. I don't think there's hardly any book that's ever been done this way. Both as a research scholar, she went and trained as a research historian, and as someone very close to the person that she wrote the biography. So it's a very unique, rich portrayal of a man. So I think that it takes a lot to dedicate yourself that much to learning about African American history and music history, because not because you're just curious about it, because you're committed to it. Rick Lawn, I got to know Rick when we put together a wonderful conference and series of concerts honoring the great trumpet player Clifford Brown. We felt that Clifford Brown he was born and raised in Wilmington, but he had a strong Philadelphia connection. And one of our people I worked on it, the pianist Don Glandon, had such an interest in Clifford that he made a terrific documentary. But he also, sort of manipulated the city, the mayor's office, to provide a plaque. I don't think it's the mayor's office. Anyway, he got a plaque on the sidewalk on Broad Street honoring Clifford Brown. So all that came together, had these wonderful concerts. And really the point man for the whole thing was Rick. And I just saw his dedication and this kind of relating to people, the way he related to everybody to bring it together was really moving to me. It just all came together. I didn't even know how it happened. But Rick is involved in a lot of different things in music. He was recently retired as the Dean of the College of Performing Arts at the University of Arts in Philly, and a long history of academic teaching of music and jazz. But he also, and before that, he was the chair of the Department of Music and the founding director of Jazz Studies at University of Texas at Austin. But he also is a terrific baritone sax player. And he also has a group called The Power of Pen that I reviewed for All About Jazz. That's a phenomenal group, and he writes all the arrangements and some of the tunes. It's a magnificent group. He does, and he's published several books on jazz. Experiencing Jazz is a classic. And then he recently wrote a book called Jazz Scores and Analysis, which is really a book for those who write jazz, compose and arrange. But it has interviews in it with the people that wrote the scores. It's an amazing book. He does everything. And so when I thought of inviting Rick to be a kind of commentator and share his ideas, I just found out then that he is a real big Dexter Gordon fan. And, so perfect match for tonight. So with that, let me turn it over to Maxine, and we'll go with where you're at and talk, and then open it up to the audience.
Be careful
Careful,
with the
Vic.
chair.
Yeah,
You coming up?
yeah, I will eventually. Go ahead, start.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Labyrinth Books, and thank you, Vic, for nagging and insisting. And I was like, well, I have to leave for Europe. He was like, well, you can come to Princeton before you go to Europe. I'm not leaving till Tuesday. But I'm giving you this. And Vic did a very early interview with me. Why was it? Was it about around midnight? I'm not sure, but he wanted to. And you can imagine, you got a sample now, it's like hours on the phone. Hours, and call back, more questions, more talking, and then somehow he edited it down to a very long interview, but people love that interview.
We've had over 50,000 readers.
See, 50,000. I don't know why, but anyway. So he became my friend, and he reminds me of jazz musicians that I've worked with, where they, tell you how they want everything to run, and I think it should be like this and that, and then you completely ignore them and do it. And so he was very worried about the time, like we should organize, and then he took more time than, he wanted us to take. So anyway, I'm very interested in people who heard Dexter, how they feel about his music. I already met a whole bunch of guys that heard him when he came back from Europe. He lived in Europe for 14 years, 1962 to 75, 76. We said 14 years, but nobody corrected that in the book. I was telling them that I was waiting for the jazz police, we call them the jazz police, to read the book and say, oh no, you made a mistake on page so-and-so. And only so far, I'm going to tell you the mistake. Somebody wrote to me and they said, you say in the book that Dexter Gordon's father died when he was 14. Well, I looked it up. And he's buried in Los Angeles. They sent me a picture of the tombstone of Dexter's father, and that he died on Christmas Eve, 1936, which Dexter would not have been 14. He would have been 13 for another 2 months until his birthday was February 27th. And so I thought, oh my God, how could I make that mistake? I mean, look it up. And the source for the mistake was Dexter, who said, I was 14 when my father died, and Duke Ellington, who said, Dexter Gordon's father was my doctor, and I was waiting for him at the Dunbar Hotel on Christmas Eve, and they came and said he died in his office. He was a doctor in Los Angeles. He had a heart attack and died, he said, and Dexter was 14. I thought, well, those were my sources of information, so I just think I'll leave it at 14. But other than that, if you find something, I'm happy to correct it in the next edition. But, because I guess you know what the jazz police are? I'll just tell you what they are. These are people that, want jazz to stay in whatever era they like. They get very nervous if you try to say anything about young people. And don't say anything about hip hop. Because I once said in an interview how much I like Fat Joe. I don't know if you know about Fat Joe, but he's a rapper. He's from the Bronx. I work in the Bronx at Fordham. And so we have to know about hip hop because you cannot be in the Bronx and act like you never heard of hip hop. I mean, you would be, you'd have to leave the Bronx. So I started listening, and he's a rapper who's super smart, super political. He sent plane loads of food and medicine to Puerto Rico after the hurricane, and he's just a fascinating guy, and so I mentioned him once, not in your interview, but some other interview, and they were like, oh my God, no, she didn't mention Fat Joe. What happened to her? I thought she loved our Blakey, You can love our Blakey and know that, stuff is moving forward, and, maybe young people who like hip hop might like jazz, So anyway, that's my goal. So Vic doesn't want me to talk too long, but I just want to say that. No,
I think you can talk as long as you want to.
oh, you said that?
Yeah. I said you.
No, I don't. Really want to open up a discussion, but I just want to say about the book that if you read the book, you know that when it's Dexter's book. He began writing it. We were living in Cuernavaca after he made the film Around Midnight, and we were living in Mexico, and he got an offer to write an autobiography with a writer. So, being Dexter Gordon, he said, oh, I think I'll write it with James Baldwin. And I was like, okay, good idea. So he called James Baldwin, and he was like, Jimmy, you want me to write a book, my autobiography, why don't we write it together? And so Baldwin said, you know, that's a good idea. He said, but I'm not doing too well, I'm ill. He said, so you write it. Tell them, you know, you write music, you play the saxophone, you can write a book. You know, it's not that hard. So Dexter told the publisher, James Baldwin said, I don't need a co-writer. I can't do it. They were like, okay. So he began writing his own autobiography on yellow legal pads, which probably some people here remember those.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, good.
So sad.
And do they still have yellow legal pads? Oh,
The only
good.
thing you can take it in is legal size.
Oh, into the library, yeah. And so he began writing, and then we were living in Mexico, so we had this Olivetti typewriter, so I typed it up with carbon paper. And then we remember carbon paper. And then he would make corrections and then talk about it. And one day I said, you know, I think this would be easier if you made an outline. And he was like, no, I'm not making an outline. I'm just going to write memories. I'm going to write these vignettes about my life, you know, and the musicians and, you know, how this all worked out so well. Because his line was, you know, my life has a happy ending. It's not like these tragic jazz stories that people love, you know, the tragic ending. So I was like, oh no, but you really should have an outline. It'll make it easier. And he was like, I'm not writing a book in order of my life, you know, birth to death. He said, I want people to be able to move through the book any place they want. So I was thinking about the people we met outside. You could open the book to where you first heard him and read about that, and then you could go back or forward, and that was how, you know, his idea of how to write the book. But of course, I went to graduate school, so and then before he died, he said, if I don't finish the book, promised me to finish it. And I was like, yeah, no problem. Because of course I had no idea how hard it is to write a biography and get the history right. He was much older than me. He was born in 1923. Sometimes people say, oh, you look so good. And I was like, I'm not born in 1923. Thank you, though. Thank you. So, but, you know, I didn't exactly go against his wishes, but I did. You don't have to read the book in order, but it's organized in order. And then he agreed to the outline, which is very unusual that he would agree with me about anything. He's like already knew, once he knew what he wanted, there was not much point in arguing. I'd have like 25 good reasons why we should do something he didn't want to do, and he never would do it. You know, so don't, because that was funny, you saw a photo and you said it looked like I was telling him what to do or something.
Right, there's a photo of her, it was a billboard, you were telling me it was a billboard. There's a famous photograph of Dexter and Maxine, and Dexter is looking down admiringly at Maxine, and they're looking at, you know, this
Billboard magazine.
yeah, that they had just been published on them. But you could see the feeling of admiration that he had for her. And
No, but you said you thought it looked like I was
yeah, I thought she was the boss.
that was his.
She says that Dexter was the boss.
No, but he interpreted you know, so interesting, because when I was working on the book, I would use a photo for each section of the book and try and like interpret the photo. If, you know, and think if I had like one of him with Louis Armstrong or Billy Eckstine Band, I'd try to think, you know, what is this photo saying? Or there's one of Melba Liston when she's sitting on the piano, you know, the famous photo. So that photo keeps coming up, you know, and so that was, you know, people interpret photos differently, right? So he interpreted it in that way. I was like, well, obviously you don't know anything about jazz musicians because I was a road manager and nobody ever listened to anything. That, you know, I mean, I was very successful because I carried the passport and the money. And our lady said, she's very good because she doesn't drink, she doesn't use drugs, and she carries the passports and the money. So when I worked with the bands, they never missed a gig or a train. I just want you to know that I was the road manager of the year, yes, thank you. But no, they don't listen to anybody. That's why they're so good at what they do. You know? Playing, they're very good. Anyway, I did promise to finish the book because, of course, I didn't know what that meant, and I promised to go back to school and finish college. And he said, I'm going to leave you money to finish college because I think you regret not finishing college, and really I think he regretted not going to college. So, you know, it was kind of his way. So, anyway, it took quite a long while, but I did finish. I almost wrote an 800-page book because Robin Kelly was my PhD advisor, and he wrote the book on Thelonious Monk, which is a great book, and it's 800 pages. So I thought, I can write an 800-page book on Dexter. And then my editor said, maybe you could write a book that people could carry on the subway. That would be a good idea. And I thought, so I looked at books that you could live, you know, 800 pages does not go in your bag on the subway. You could read it at home. So I looked at books, and all that research material that's not in the book will be in the Library of Congress in case anybody here would like to go and write another book on Dexter Gordon. There are like several other books that could be written. So, but in the end, I think he would like the book. I mean, that was, you know, what took me so long was to try to write a book that was the book he was thinking of, that honored all the other players. He didn't think he was better than anybody. He might have been taller, but he didn't play better than anybody. And he thought there were so many great musicians who never got, you know, what they should have gotten, never got the, hi, wow, oh my God, look at, oh, wow. He's one of the great drummers. How'd you get here?
He drove.
Wow, 2 hours, Bill Goodwin. Yay! Wow, thank you. Did you read the book yet? Oh, my friends drove 2 hours, see? Okay, I'm handing it over to Rick. So, you know, after he talks about Dexter, then we're going to talk to you some more. Okay, Jim, don't worry. Oh, okay. Please, you know, join in the conversation, especially Bill, because he's from LA, so he knows that part and other parts. Okay. Done.
Thank you. The first thing I have to say before I start is, as a saxophone player and having to follow Maxine and Vic, I feel like I'm about ready to solo following Sonny Rollins or something. And to maybe start by using a phrase that I got from Jim McNeely when I interviewed him for my recent book. You think?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Jim, I asked Jim McNeely a question when I was interviewing him for my last book, and he said, oh boy, he said, that puts me in my Wayback Machine. And I really have to say that the book put me in my sort of personal Wayback Machine, because Dexter, at so many points in my life, the stories that were in the book resonated with my own sort of pathways through life as a musician and a teacher and so on. I started out very much as a player. That's what I wanted to do. And somehow I navigated into the academic circles, but still maintained a profile to some degree as a player and as a composer-arranger. But the first story that really got me, and Maxine and I were talking about this at the cafe earlier today, was the story. How many people have read the book? Let me. Okay, good.
Oh, good.
Then I'm not repeating something.
I'll buy it.
I'll get to read it tomorrow.
Dexter actually, this is actually, as I recall, one of Dexter's own writings that you used. And he tells the story about being at home, and he's a 16-year-old, I think? 17. And he's at home, and he gets a call from his friend, Marshall Royal, who was a little older, you know? And says, we want you to come out and join Lionel Hampton's band. And of course, at first, as a young 16-year-old, Dexter apparently didn't believe Marshall. You're pulling my leg.
No, he thought it was one of his friends, pretending to be Marshall.
Exactly. Okay. Well, fast forward many years, and I'm sitting in my parents' home having Sunday dinner in Springfield, PA, which is a little suburb of Philly, and the phone rang, and a friend of mine who was a little older, much like Marshall in his relationship with Dexter, calls me, Vinny DiMartino, and he says, I'm out with Lionel Hampton's band, and we need an alto player. You want to come? Well, right away, what do I think? Come on, Vinny. They used to call me Stick Man because I was so skinny, and I'm just figuring this is another prank. So we went back and forth, and finally, the next thing I know, there's this black man's voice on the phone, and it's Hamp. This was no BS, you know. We really do want you, can you come to New York, such and such a day, such and such a studio, and and I was an old guy. I was 19, not 16. And it was like the experience of my life, as I'm sure it was for Dexter. And one of our first gigs, and the book reminded me of this as well, and the comment that made earlier about the really difficult, trying life that some of these musicians had, and to some degree still struggle, in different ways perhaps. But one of our first gigs was really a wake-up call, as was the whole road thing, as it was, I'm sure, with Dexter. One of our first gigs was Rikers Island Prison. And many of his former bandmates were inmates. It was like old home week. And like some of the charts that we were playing in the book were written by guys who had suits on, striped suits, you know. Hey, how are you, skinny, you know. It was and I'm just like a 19-year-old trying to deal with all this and reconcile it in my own mind. When I got to graduate school is when I really discovered Dexter as a tremendously unique voice as a soloist. And to me, he played like a singer, particularly ballads. His phrasing, his sound was so incredibly personal. And that became very much, I think, part of my obsession. I transcribed a lot of his solos and so on. And then I ended up in Iowa teaching. And where did I end up? Has anybody seen the video series that was produced by Iowa Public Broadcasting and commercially available for a minute, for a short time, called Jazz at the Maintenance Shop? They were great. I think Phil Woods did one. Bill Evans did one. Yeah?
Dexter did one.
Dexter, exactly. And I was in the audience for the Dexter one. I was teaching in Cedar Falls, Iowa, at the University of Northern Iowa, and the maintenance shop was on the campus of Iowa State University. And I later befriended the producer of that great series. And I just learned from Maxine that her son is getting the rights back, working on that from IPPN, so that they can release that whole series, which is great, because the audio is fantastic on that stuff.
Yeah.
As well as the video, because this producer, John Byer, was actually ahead of his time in terms of producing those kinds of things. Well, in 1980, I ended up in Austin, Texas, where who did I discover retired, not playing at all, completely unknown, raising okra in a community garden in Round Rock, Texas, which is a little suburb of Austin, with Gene Ramey, the great bassist. The famous picture of Bird with the bass player, that's Gene. And I got him sort of back in the scene. He started running jam sessions. We were thinking about doing a book together, and he died. And of course, in the book, I learned that he was the bass player on Dexter's first date for Savoy, I think. Yeah, 1945, I believe. Yeah. And Ramey was on the first trio sides with Monk as the bass player. I remember talking to him about Monk, you know, and he was always trying to figure him out because he was kind of an old school swing era bass player. But the other thing that happened that connects to the book and your research, oddly enough, was when you get the book, which you have to because it's like a page turner. It really is. It's like reading a Harry Bosch detective story.
Oh, yeah.
It's great. It's great because
George
it's
Cables is in Harry Bosch, you know.
right, but it's real. You know,
Yeah.
that's the thing. It's real. I was there only a few short years and somehow got involved in correspondence that the University of Texas received from Ross Russell. Well, Ross Russell, who's Ross Russell? Ross Russell was the guy who was, I guess, the first to record Bird as a soloist, and maybe the second to record Dexter? Something like that. He was in the process of retiring. He was a recluse. He lived in a trailer in the Salton Sea, which is, you know, an arid desert area in California. And he wanted to sell his archive. Well, I twisted some arms, even though I was an assistant professor, you know, without tenure. And eventually convinced them to spend the bucks and buy the Ross Russell archive, which is a treasure trove of Dexter Gordon research, as well as Bird, of course, and Red Rodney, and even, oddly enough, Schoenberg, Arnold Schoenberg. That Dial Records recorded when they got out of jazz, which was strange. So my life is kind of crisscrossed in some ways, following Dexter in a way. And of course the title of the book, Sophisticated Giant, that happens to be one of my Desert Island records, because as an arranger, the arrangements by Slide Hampton on that record are just to die for. They're beautiful. And maybe we can get into talking about that, because I'm fascinated to hear about how much rehearsal was involved, and had to be a lot, because the charts were really demanding, and the playing was gorgeous. There's a great quote that I'll summarize my description of Dexter, because it's his own quote. And I actually have an audio clip of him saying this. And I can't quote it completely. But he says, if you're going to play a ballad, you have to know the lyrics. And he's absolutely right.
Good.
I'm done.
We don't have a lot of time.
Tell what you said in the restaurant about Dexter's sound and how you feel about his sound. Remember what you said?
Well, I mean, I just think his sound was,
It was profound.
I always say profound things. But anyway, I don't remember what I said, but I've always been impressed by, moved is a better word. If I can listen to Dexter Gordon record, it always affects me in my heart. I mean, his improvising is just so brilliant, you know, but the way he played, he was obviously trying to speak from the soul, you know, and his sound, you told a little story about his sound, how much that affected people, just the sound of his instrument, the way he played it. Just tell that little story about
the fellow that went to hear him at, I think,
Yeah.
Copenhagen.
It's in the book. And a friend of Dexter, a man who became his friend, they were jazz fans in Copenhagen. They were waiting, they heard he's coming from England. Oh, he didn't come that night, he's coming next week. And when Dexter first went to Europe, he went for 2 weeks and he stayed 14 years. So while he was in London, he got a call to go to Copenhagen to the Montmartre, and he went. And so these jazz fans were waiting every night, and then when he did show up and played, Torben Ulrich, who was a famous tennis player in Denmark, fainted. And, you know, Dexter loved that story. He said, tell him what happened when you first heard me, you know. He was so overwhelmed by the sound. They listened, they heard Louis Armstrong, they had records, but he'd never heard anything like that live, and he literally fainted. He wasn't drunk. I asked him, and he's now 90, and he came to my talk in Oakland, and I was like, oh my God, it's Torben Ulrich. His son is the Lars Ulrich from Metallica, and Dexter is the godfather of Lars Ulrich because his friend is Torben Ulrich, who's now 90. So I gave him the mic, and he told that story again, and he said, every time I saw Dexter, he'd say, tell them what happened. But, you know, after I put that in the book, you know, people said, you know, when I heard him, I had to lie down. I mean, when the first time I heard him, and they called the Dexter Gordon moment, and then the first time I heard him, I was like, oh my God, you know, what is this? Because if you're not prepared, I only had heard him on recording, and then you hear him in person, you're like, oh my God, how is this possible? And he said the reason he had the sound, you know, the sound is his sound, but the reason he could project the sound was because he sat in front of Art Blakey in the Billy Eckstine band. And he said, if you sit in front of Art Blakey, you better be able to project. Because, you know, and he never, and he used to say to Rufus Reed when he had the quartet, Rufus, if the electricity goes out, will you be able to be heard? Because he was like, you know, we have to be able to play without amplification. Because in their band, they didn't need amplification, right? In your band, you played without amplification. Yeah. So, and Dexter liked that. You know, he liked that, and he would make that joke to the bass player who didn't think it was funny. Bass players never think anything's funny. I hate to generalize, but, you know, we know this is a fact, right? You agree with this? A drummer agree about bass players? They never think anything's funny? Okay. But now I want to say one more thing about the sound. I lost it. Okay.
Okay, you know, we don't have a lot of time, so I thought we'd like the folks to be able to have a chance to share. I wish we had all night, there's so much to talk about, but I would, just to set the stage for your sharing, trigger some thoughts. Two things. One is, if you ever heard Dexter Gordon live, could you tell us what that was, what you remember? Probably a few people here would do.
They're back there.
And the other is, if you have any questions or comments for Maxine, because we only have a short time.
Do we? How much time do we
We
have?
only have about 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
How much time do we have?
15 minutes, 20 minutes?
Yeah. So let's open it up, whatever comes to your mind, but maybe those will trigger some thoughts.
So I'm gonna go around with the mic so that everyone can hear.
I'm gonna go unamplified.
But you won't be heard on the recording, so.
Maxine, my question, I have the book and I intend to start reading it, and I apologize if you covered this in the book.
That's okay.
But could you talk to Dexter's relationship with Charlie Parker?
Okay. That's very good. He talked about Bird all the time, and he said once to Dizzy, like 1988, I mean late, he was like, Dizzy said, and this relates to John Perkins. So Dizzy said to him, you know, you're starting to get it. You sound, you are, you know, I think you almost got it. I was like, John. And we called Dizzy Gillespie John, that's his proper name. Dexter got it. And, you know, of course, you know, it's the dumbest thing to do is like you say something to Dizzy Gillespie, like you know something, you know, because of course you don't. And Dexter said, no, he's right. He said there are only two people who can really play bebop, and that would be Bird and Dizzy. The rest of us are trying to learn how to play it. And that's why we practice every day. Isn't that something?
Yes.
You know, he was like, no. And the other thing he said about Bird is if he wasn't so slick and he'd gotten busted, he would have lived longer. Because, you know, Dexter had a period, had a whole decade of being incarcerated and being a drug user in the 50s. And he said that gave him time to like think about his life. He learned group therapy. They had group therapy in Chino prison. He always was telling people, you know, counseling's not just for white people, you know. It's a good thing, it's good, it helps, you know. We have to know why we do these stupid things, right? But he said Bird was so slick, he never got busted, not once, no matter what he did. And he said that made his life much shorter. And you know, so, but he said what he did in the 35 years he lived, you know, we could live to be, you know, 100 and never do what he did. So.
Thank you.
Can I just add one quick musical anecdote to that? I was listening just the other day to the Chase, which is that famous dial recording with Warren O'Gray and Dexter, right, to simulate the live jam. It actually took two sides of the 78 to do it. And there's an intro with that tune. Well, that's the same intro from Bird's Klaktovitstenstein.
Yeah.
But it was recorded after Dexter recorded his. So, you know they knew each other and they were hanging, you know, I mean, because that wouldn't have happened. There's just no way. Either they were at a jam session together and which came first, the chicken or the egg? I mean, no one will, I don't think, ever know that. That's a very hit intro, too. I mean,
But Teddy Edwards said they all stole it from him. Did you? Teddy Edwards in an interview, I didn't put it in the book because it makes him sound like, but really, he told me Up in Dodo's Room is the first bebop solo, and they all stole it from me. And I was like, well, didn't we kind of share, not steal? And he was like, no, they stole it. So, but, you know, Bird was, you know, to this day, right? Bird is it, right?
So we have a question here, and then in the back, and then I'll come over there.
Oh, that's my friend.
Hey, how you doing?
That's a
So
great
good to see you.
photographer. A great photographer.
I guess the thing that I would like to share is about 1976, it may have been right after the concert in New York, Dexter came to the new Foxhole Theater on the University of Pennsylvania campus, and it was him, Mickey Roker, along with Slide Hampton, and my mind is going blank. But what I remember about that, it was in an old church, and I wrote a poem about it, that the church rocked off the rafters and melted the roof, and the lyricism, the interplay between Dexter and the rest of the band was just absolutely, it still resonates in my mind because it was that powerful. And above all, he was a poet.
Yes.
He was a poet, a very, very lyrical poet. That's all.
Good. And Mickey Roker.
Mickey
See,
Roker.
now, you call Mickey Roker's name, that's, you know, Dizzy's drummer, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, Mickey
Absolutely.
Roker was,
Slide was in there.
right?
Ronnie Matthews was on piano.
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
Ronnie
So
Matthews
was
was
it
on piano.
Stafford James?
Stafford James was on
Yeah,
bass.
yeah,
There you
yeah,
go.
yeah.
Yep,
That was
absolutely.
it.
That was the band.
That
Now,
was
what
it.
year was that?
This was
76.
76, 1976. Right after he hadn't been
Right
back
after
home.
he came back.
Right, yeah, that was great.
All right, we're gonna jump over here, back there, and then coming back.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Just a quick thing, I just wanted to say, I found out about this entire event promptly an hour before it happened.
Okay.
I just wanted to do so much. Thank you so much, Maxine, for being here,
Oh.
coming out to do this. It's just awesome to have everybody, and awesome to have this event come to town and have this kind of culture around for us younger folk to
Good.
be able to take advantage of just the knowledge of those who've come before us. So that's all.
Oh,
Thank you.
that's great. And it's only an hour and a half to Princeton. Who knew? It's like going to Philly, you know, and I was saying, because I'm back and forth to Philly my whole life, I have family, and Shirley Scott, and I quoted Philly Joe Jones used to say, oh, let's go to Philly, it's only an hour away. I was like, it's 90 miles. He said, yeah, an hour away. Right.
All right, the mic's back here.
First of all, thank all of you and Labyrinth for hosting this. This is great. I was just wondering if there were any guitarists who were hanging around with Dexter. Were there any that he had opinions on? Maybe people like Grant Green or
Grant Green. Yeah.
any insight?
Are you a guitar player?
Obviously,
Obviously. Obviously. Well, what I do remember is not so much him, but us who grew up in that period, which would be me, is you couldn't like Grant Green and Wes Montgomery. You had to, you know, you couldn't like Wynton Kelly and Rick Garland. You know, you had to like go in your lane, you know. So when I told that to Dexter once, and he was like, yeah, that makes sense. I'd have to go with Grant Green. He loved Grant Green, I know that. But guitar, you know, he didn't play in a lot of bands with guitar. Did he record with any?
Philip Catherine, around midnight. Steeplechase. Philip Catherine, Billy Higgins.
Oh, Philip Catherine, yeah, right. Because this gentleman knows the steeplechase recordings, yeah. Yeah, he loves those steeplechase recordings. Yeah, Philip Catherine, he liked him.
Yes, and he's very good.
He's very good, yeah.
Okay, we're back over here.
Oh, good.
I just wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed your reflections. And as a musician, I think that a lot of people who are not musicians don't understand this, that as a musician, you have the church of music. And you're kind of anointed to do it. People say, well, you're not classically trained, you're not this, you're not that. You are given the gift. And human beings have a way of messing up religion, so, you know, we're not going to talk about religion, we're not going to talk about this and that, but it is a gift. And we do acknowledge it, and it's been such a pleasure. I don't know about this man, but I will get his records now. And I just thank you for that. And I'm blessed to know that he blessed all of you.
Oh, thank you.
It's wonderful.
Very nice, lovely.
Other questions or reflections over there? Yes?
You. Oh, I just wanted to interject that our bookseller, this is a beautiful bookstore in a great place, but our bookseller is from Berlin, and when I'm going to tell you a story, you'll like it. I think Bill Goodwin knows this. I was in this bar called Boomers, which was, you know, where musicians played and hung out in New York. And the head of the Berlin Jazz, I thought of this because you're from Berlin, Berlin Jazz Festival, George Gruntz, who, remember George Gruntz? And, you know, he had the orchestra. He was in there, and he said, you know, I'm looking for someone to bring the musicians over. I don't want to keep coming back and forth to New York. And we were sitting in there, and this is before I met Dexter. And Louis Hayes, the drummer, was sitting there. He said, oh, she could do it. Max can do that. And I was like, really? I've never done that. And he was like, oh, she could do that. And so that was my first big job as a tour manager and road manager, because I did get the job with Roberta Flack, and you know, my first job was 50 musicians going from New York to Berlin. So the moral here is, if you don't know what you're doing, sometimes you do a better job. I love Berlin. I love Berlin.
All right.
Oh, Bill Goodwin.
Yeah, we'll get to you. I gave the mic here, then I'll come.
This is a short thing. I happened to see Dexter Gordon at the Keystone Corner in San Francisco, 78, 79 that winter, and it was a fantastic show. But he got to this place where it was an ecstatic high, which I wasn't really expecting. He just knocked me on my floor. It was just a wonderful night, and that was a great club to go to
What's
at
the
the time.
name? You know that Tal Barkin's opening in Keystone Corner in Baltimore?
No, I didn't
Yeah,
know
next
that.
month.
Wow,
in
that's
April.
fantastic.
Yeah, we can
Tremendous.
go to Baltimore, it's not that far.
I have friends in Baltimore.
Yeah, good.
90 miles.
Yeah, the Keystone, because that was, used to do the Christmas, New Year's there with Max Roach. Yeah, that was great.
Great place.
Great. This is Bill Goodwin.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. So, Maxine, as you know, I wanted to ask you one particular question, which is, do you still play the cello?
That's so mean.
No, that
It's so mean.
I thought you played quite
Are you
well.
channeling your father? Are you doing the radio thing?
We used to do chamber music, but this at Steve Swallow's house. I seem to remember.
Yes, you seem to
1969.
remember.
Anyway,
You know, it's really bad when your old friends show up and then they like remember you. But Steve Swallow, Eddie Gomez.
you're one of the first people I met when I moved to New York, because I stayed with Steve. And my voice sounds really funny. I stayed with Steve and used to come over with your ex-husband Jack, and you guys would play chamber music. And I think Stephen would play the piano, which was, amusing in itself. Anyway, I met Dexter in 1960. I was 18 years old, aspiring jazz drummer in Los Angeles. There was a jam session at the Hotel Watkins in Washington Avenue every Monday night, and Dexter ran the session. With John Huston on piano, Herbie Lewis on bass, and Kenny Dennis on drums, who was married to Nancy Wilson. He was the house drummer at the Watkins. And you could go down, and if you get in the rotation, you could get to play with Dexter. And of course, I was a fan. I had bought the record. I was a West Coast jazz fan. I bought the record he made with Stan Levy. So Stanley, he wrote the Stanley the Steamer piece for Stan. The record's called This Time the Drums on Me. And it was just marvelous. And Stan was one of my mentors and friends. So he was telling me, Dexter is like the original bebopper. And I knew his reputation, and I knew what he sounded like. I used to go down and see him play, so, and then one night, I got a chance to go up and play. And we played, I remember we played the Blues Walk, and Herbie and John and I think Lawrence Marable had been there as a marvelous drummer, but not, at that stage of his life, not a particularly nice person. And he had been offered a chance to play, but he said he didn't feel like it, and he went to leave. And I got to play, and now I'm playing with Dexter Gordon. And at 18, I was inconsistent, but I was having a good night. And everybody was having a good time. Also, I had Lawrence Marable pulling on my arm, so let me play, man. I changed my mind. And I told him basically, leave me alone. And he left in a huff. And I look up if this is going on, and I'm still playing. I look up, and Dexter was looking at it. Dexter was standing, he's like this, checking me out. And so years later, Dexter came back to New York. I would see you. I'd go down to the Vanguard, and I would occasionally drive him back to his hotel. Whatever. We sat several times in front of his hotel on 7th Avenue, and just an hour, 3 or 4 hours, and just talked. And he told me that when he saw that I stood up to Lawrence, who was really, nasty, could be, he turned out to be a beautiful, beautiful cat. When he got sober, he became a really nice person. But anyway, we spent hours just talking about LA, and he told me about the old days, and I told him what I've been doing, and he treated me like I was his nephew or something. 20 years later, we were in that jazz festival in Sao Paulo, and Phil's group was there, and Dexter's group, Woody's group was there, and we were all in the hotel together. So I see Dexter, we were playing sequentially, we didn't play the same night. So Dexter played a few nights before we did, but I was just there hanging with him in the dressing room,
And then we finally played, like the last day of the festival or whatever, where people come to, I didn't know you played, I thought you were Dexter's bodyguard. Because I'm 6'5" also, and I think I probably outweighed him a little bit. Anyway, so we ended up, I'll finish up, but one night, I never told you the story, but we went out for a walk. We ran into each other late and had a drink, and then Dexter said, well, let's take a walk. So, you know, we were just walking around the streets, and he says, you know, let's find a place to have another drink before we get back to the hotel. We're walking along, and all of a sudden, out of this bar, it has like these swinging doors, and 4 people come out, and they're fighting and grappling on the street, and they're right in front of us. And I go, oh my God, and Dexter says, this looks like a good place. He went ahead, I went back to the hotel. The next morning he told me, you know, really nice people were there. Glad to hear it. I think, you know, he had a certain charm about him, as you well know. Anyway, great to see you.
Dexter loved Bill Woods. and you. Yeah, don't we all?
So maybe this is a good moment to pause, and we can continue over a glass of wine. You all can get a book signed. I have a confession to make, which is that we've been selling more of this book than I had calculated on.
Oh, you
and
too?
Yeah, they're more on the way. We still have some, but then if we do run out, they're more on the way, and they'll be here on Friday. I have, if that works for you, I have stickers, and you could have Maxine autograph them and keep, you know, hang on to that, and then just come back on Friday for a copy. With my apologies, that's like a rookie mistake. And maybe we won't run out, but just in case, that's our backup plan.
I just want to tell you that over the Christmas holiday, Amazon underestimated the sale.
Oh. Don't you put
No, not comparing you to Amazon. So, but what they did was they did something illegal. They did a POD, that's print on demand, where they didn't have the beautiful cover and they didn't do the blue end papers. So if you bought one, which you probably did not, you can return it and get a credit and then come here and buy a real one. But the publisher said, well, actually, you know, that might be a good thing that, you know, the book is selling. But I was like, oh no, but then not with the ugly bootleg. Anyway,
all right, well, this has been just absolutely great. Please join me in thanking our guests.
Oh, that's so nice what you said.
Thank you very much. Both of you.
My pleasure.
Don't let anybody steal this copy.
Absolutely.